Hey guys, tonight we start on the damp cobblestones of La Rochelle's harbor, October 12th, 1307. The night has that kind of wet chill that slides down your collar and makes you tuck your shoulders without thinking. The air tastes faintly of salt fish and smoke from hearth fires drifting in from the city. Lantern light from the fortress walls wobbles across the black surface of the water, breaking into scattered gold ripples. Out there, half swallowed by shadow, the Templar fleet waits tall masts, swaying slowly, like the ribs of some massive sleeping creature. You can feel something brewing in the dark. Not the rowdy kind of commotion you get before a battle, but a tighter, quieter hum, like a room full of people holding their breath. And yes, let's be clear, you probably wouldn't survive this if you decided to swim after them into the North Atlantic without a wetsuit, a compass, and several layers of stubbornness. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me your location and the local time where you are right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're leaning against a moss-slick bollard, feeling the cold seep through your sleeves when you get your first good look at the Templar ships. They're longer and leaner than most merchant vessels' hulls, painted in dark, tar-rich pitch to resist rot and disguise them at sea. Along the stern and amidships, the red cross of the order catches the moonlight like a drop of blood on polished steel. These aren't patched-up fishing boats. They're masterpieces of shipwright engineering, the result of decades of experience ferrying men treasure and dangerous secrets across 2 continents. Historically speaking, La Rochelle was the jewel in the Templar maritime crown. Most ports in medieval Europe were under the watchful eyes of kings, dukes, or bishops. But La Rochelle, it was under the Templars themselves. They owned the docks, the warehouses, the customs houses. They decided who could load, unload, and most important, who could watch. Which is why tonight, despite what's about to happen, the scene isn't crawling with royal inspectors or curious merchants. It's quiet, controlled. Somewhere behind you, the city's narrow streets wind into darkness. Torches flare along the fortress wall, but there are no bells, no alarm. You hear gulls bickering over scraps left by the fishmongers earlier in the day, and from the far end of the quay, the hollow thump of barrels being rolled onto decks. Every so often, a cloaked figure moves past, silent, quick, carrying the rigid posture of someone trained to obey without question. The scent in the air shifts as a breeze curls off the water. It's not just the brine of the harbor now. There's beeswax, a trace of incense. Odd cargo for warships. Quirkier still, the fragrance comes from the largest vessel moored on the outer edge where access is most restricted. Historians still argue whether the fleet carried gold relics or manuscripts that night. But whatever's inside those crates isn't the kind of thing you'd risk leaving behind for King Philip's men to paw through. You shift your weight and glance toward the harbor mouth. The moon hangs low, a silver coin resting on the rim of the Atlantic. Beyond that narrow exit, there's nothing but cold water and weeks of uncertain sailing. The ocean looks almost too calm tonight, a glassy black, that might just swallow these ships whole without leaving a ripple. Near the harbor gate, a cart rattles over the cobbles, its iron-rimmed wheels clinking like coins in a coffer. The driver says nothing. No greetings, no curses at his tired horses. 4 men in plain wool tunics slide down from the cart bed and lift out long, narrow boxes. They're not shaped like barrels or chests. They're more like oversized coffins, though that's probably not the bedtime image you wanted. Without ceremony, the men carry them up the gangplank of a mid-sized vessel, then vanish back into the mist without even a backward glance. Somewhere in the stillness, you hear the sigh of rope against wood as a mooring line is quietly loosened. It's a sound you'd miss if you weren't listening for it. A second follows, and a third. Out on the farthest pier, a lantern flashes, once shielded, unshielded, shielded again. The reply comes from a ship near the mouth of the harbor, one slow swing of a lamp, then darkness. Everything about this feels rehearsed. There's no shouting, no last-minute confusion, no scrambling for missing crew. The ships are stocked, the sails are furled, the tide is just beginning to turn outward. And you can sense the clock ticking, though no one here would call it that. For them, it's more like a tide that must be caught exactly on its pull or lost entirely. A gull drifts overhead, silent this time, as though even the birds understand the need for quiet. Somewhere in the city, a door slams, and you see a faint light appear in a second-story window. A woman leans out, hair-loose eyes scanning the harbor. She lingers a moment, then disappears inside, closing the shutters tight. Maybe she knows these ships won't be here in the morning. Maybe she knows why. Your gaze follows the curve of the dock to the largest ship in the fleet. On its stern, you spot a carved emblem, not the standard cross, but something more intricate, a circle, enclosing a star, its points slightly uneven. You make a mental note of it. Centuries from now, someone might argue about whether it meant anything. Historians still argue whether such symbols were shipwrights' marks or coded identifiers for certain cargo. Tonight it feels like both. The wind shifts again, pushing the smell of pitch and salt toward you. The lines are coiled ready. The men on deck move like shadows, bending, lifting, securing each one part of a pattern you can't fully see. You realize this isn't chaos. This is choreography, and the next beat is coming. When it does, you'll either be standing alone in an empty harbor, staring at a few bare posts and a sheet of black water, or you'll be watching a piece of history sail away into darkness, leaving only questions in its wake. You feel the damp air tighten against your skin as you move back along the dock, careful not to draw attention. Somewhere beyond the fortress wall, a low murmur rises and falls like wind in trees, except there are no trees here. It's the sound of voices trying not to be heard. You pause by a stack of coiled hemp rope, pretending to study the knots while you let your ears do the work. The words aren't clear, but the tone is unmistakable urgency wrapped in formality, the way soldiers or officials talk when they're trying not to admit they're panicked. It's in moments like this you remember the other side of the harbor, the part that doesn't smell of salt and pitch, but of parchment and ink. La Rochelle is more than a Templar port. It's a ledger entry in the mind of King Philip IV of France. And right now, that ledger is bleeding red. Historically, this is one of those uncomfortable truths. Philip isn't just a king, he's a bankrupt king. Years of wars with England and Flanders have drained his treasury, and the Templars, with their sprawling network of banks, commanderies, and treasuries, are sitting on a fortune he desperately wants. From your shadowed vantage point, you imagine the conversation that must have happened in Paris. Philip, leaning in toward Guillaume de Nogaret, his icy-eyed advisor, asking how one dismantles an order that answers to no king, that hides its gold in places even the Pope can't touch. Nogaret's answer: you hit them everywhere all at once before sunrise. You make their name poison. You wrap the arrests in charges so scandalous, the church has no choice but to look away from your real motives. And so, October 13th, 1307. A Friday. Yes, the Friday the 13th becomes the date for a coordinated strike across France. Warrants are sealed, sheriffs and bailiffs are quietly briefed, and royal agents ride out under orders to seize Templar properties, imprison their members, and confiscate their assets. The plan is ruthless, but it's also clumsy in one key way: secrecy only works if you control every ear. And here in La Rochelle, some ears clearly belong to someone else. You notice movement near the customs house. A lone figure in a plain brown cloak steps from the shadows, then disappears into an alley. Seconds later, another figure emerges at the far end of the quay, adjusting the strap of a satchel and walking quickly toward the docks. You can't prove it, but you'd bet a month's wages these aren't chance wanderers. The timing's too tight, the route's too clean. The Templars are a military order, yes, but they're also masters of logistics. They've moved men and treasure under siege, under fire across deserts and oceans. If word of the arrests reached La Rochelle, even a day in advance, that's all they'd need. They wouldn't stand their ground. Here ships are too valuable to risk in a fight they can't win. They'd leave and leave clean. Still, there's something unsettling about the stillness of the fleet. You half expect a flurry of activity crews running ropes, flying sails, unfurling, but it's the opposite. The men move with quiet efficiency as though departure isn't an escape, but an appointment they've had in the calendar for months. Near the center of the quay, two knights stand close enough for you to overhear snatches of their conversation. One mentions the northern contact and the window before tide turn. The other asks about the master's letter and whether it's been burned. You're tempted to step closer, but they break off, suddenly scanning the shadows as if they can smell you there. You duck behind the rope coil again, heart thumping. Quirky detail. One of the knights has a thin strip of red cloth tied around his upper arm, not regulation attire. In some fringe accounts, little markers like this were used during covert operations to signal group membership when uniforms had to be discarded. Historians still argue whether the Templars used such field signs or whether it's just a romantic flourish added by later storytellers. But here in the lantern glow, it feels real enough. From the city side, hoofbeats echo on the cobblestones. At first they're slow, casual, but then they pick up speed riders approaching. You glance toward the fortress gate, half expecting to see royal guards pouring through, but instead 3 cloaked horsemen slip into the dockyard. One dismounts, pulls a leather case from his saddlebag, and hands it to a man waiting in the shadows. No words are exchanged. The case disappears under the man's cloak, and the riders are gone before you can even register the steam from their horse's breath. You can't help but wonder if the contents of that case will matter in some distant place, maybe even on a different continent. A map. A letter of credit, instructions for a fleet that won't be seen again. Your eyes drift back to the ships, and you notice a subtle change. The lanterns at the stern have been doused one by one, starting from the farthest vessel inward. The masts and rigging are now just silhouettes against the pale wash of the moon. Even the faint creak of timber has subsided, as though the ships themselves are holding still for whatever comes next. And then you spot him on the far pier, a tall figure in a white surcoat with the blood-red cross stark on his chest. He's not hiding, not hurrying. He walks the length of the pier, slowly stopping at each ship, exchanging a quiet word with the captain before moving on. This is no dockhand or petty officer. This is a man with authority, the kind who doesn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed. When he reaches the last ship, he stands for a moment, looking out toward the harbor mouth, then turns and disappears below deck. Somewhere deep in the city, a bell tolls just once. Not the clamor of alarm, just the long, heavy note of time passing. But here in this charged silence, it feels like a signal. The breeze picks up, carrying the smell of wet rope and pitch past your face. You notice movement again, crew members drifting toward their stations, the slow, deliberate loosening of mooring lines, the creak of a gangplank being pulled aboard. There's no shouting, no rushing, just the clean, smooth rhythm of people who've done this 1,000 times before. You realize then that whatever orders King Philip gave, whatever accusations he's ready to unleash at sunrise, these ships won't be here to see it. The arrests will come, the trials will follow, and the chroniclers will write about the fall of the Knights Templar. But the fleet, will have slipped away into a part of the map where ink fades and questions multiply. And as you stand there watching that dark water draw them toward it, you can't decide what's more unnerving, that they're leaving, or that they seem to know exactly where they're going. The tide is creeping higher now, nudging at the barnacled stones beneath your feet. You step aside to avoid a trickle of seawater slipping between the cobblestones, and that's when you notice the first of them crates. Not the ordinary kind stamped with a merchant's name or painted with a port of origin, but rough-hewn boxes, their wood dark with pitch, their sides marked in symbols that don't belong to any shipping ledger you've ever seen. One is painted with a coiled serpent, its tongue flicking toward a crescent moon. Another bears a star, 8 points uneven, as if sketched by someone in haste. A third is marked with a squat tower whose base is wider than its top, almost like a lighthouse without a flame. None have the familiar red cross. In fact, the symbols seem designed to be unrecognizable unless you know their meaning. 2 men in simple wool tunics carry one of the serpent-marked crates up the gangplank of a mid-sized cog. They move carefully, each footfall measured as though the contents could shatter at the slightest jolt. The captain of the ship is waiting at the top hood, pulled forward, speaking so quietly you can't catch the words. One of the men nods, and the crate disappears into the shadow of the hold. This is no random loading of provisions. You've seen plenty of merchants prepare for departure, and it's always a messy business. Ropes, tangled cargo lists waved in the air, dock hands yelling at each other over who dropped the barrel of salt cod. Here it's silence, intentional. Even the thud of each crate on the deck is muffled, like someone thought to wrap the planks beneath with cloth. Historically, you know the Templars were meticulous record keepers. Every coin, every ounce of grain, every relic had its place in their ledgers. Which makes this even stranger. There's no scribe here, no clerk tallying each piece. No parchment changes hands. It's as if the record exists somewhere else, maybe in someone's memory, maybe in a letter that will never be written. You drift closer to another stack of crates resting near the customs house wall. A single lantern burns beside them, its light trembling in the breeze. The marks on these are different abstract shapes that might be letters in a language you don't recognize, or maybe just an elaborate code. One looks almost like a fishhook, another like a pair of mirrored spirals curling toward each other. You wonder if the marks are a map in themselves, a breadcrumb trail for those who will see them again far from here. From the far end of the quay, a cart rattles into view, pulled by a single mule. The driver is slouched low, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. In the bed of the cart, under a tarp, you can just make out the edges of something metallic, long, narrow shapes that catch the lantern light like the spine of a weapon. Swords, maybe, or something stranger. The Templars had a history of transporting relics that defied easy description, gilded reliquaries, bone fragments, sealed in crystal, even pieces of cloth, said to have touched the holy places of Jerusalem. The driver pulls up beside a smaller ship, one without any visible markings, and 3 figures emerge from the shadows to meet him. They're not dressed as knights. There's no armor, no tabards. They could be fishermen, except fishermen don't carry themselves like this. Shoulders squared, eyes scanning every shadow before lifting a single item from the cart. One by one, they transfer the metal shapes into the ship's hold. Not a word is spoken. Quirky detail. As one of them bends to lift a bundle, you catch sight of a small wooden charm tied around his neck. It's carved into the shape of a key, but the bow of the key is a circle etched with a cross inside. Historians still argue whether charms like these were simply devotional tokens or coded identifiers worn by certain Templar operatives. Whatever the answer, you can't shake the feeling that it means something more than superstition. The activity continues in bursts, moments of stillness, followed by quick, coordinated movement. You begin to see a rhythm to it. Crates are moved only when a certain ship's lantern is turned a quarter toward the dock. Carts appear and vanish with no overlap, as though someone is controlling the flow to avoid crowding or notice. It's the same kind of discipline you've read about in accounts of Templar supply lines during the Crusades, when entire fortresses were provisioned in a single night, without alerting an enemy a mile away. From somewhere across the harbor, you hear a faint splash, too small for a mooring line, too big for a fish. You turn just in time to see ripples spread from the stern of the largest vessel. A rowboat is slipping away from its side, a single oarsman pulling hard toward the mouth of the harbor. No lantern, no light, just the silhouette of a man bent over his work. You imagine he's carrying a message to a ship waiting beyond the shoals where the king's men won't think to look until morning. Your attention shifts back to the main pier as a group of cloaked figures approaches from the inland road. They're moving quickly, but without the clatter of arms. The leader, a tall man with a hood drawn low, carries a leather tube strapped across his back, the kind used to store maps or scrolls. Whatever's inside, it's worth carrying personally, worth protecting through the cold and damp. They don't board immediately. Instead, they huddle beside a stack of crates, speaking in low voices. You catch only fragments coastline Iberia signal. The tall man hands the leather tube to another, then nods toward the ship with the tower-marked crate. The group breaks apart, each one disappearing onto a different vessel. The longer you watch, the more you realize that nothing here is random. The serpent-marked crates all go to the same two ships. The star-marked ones vanish into another pair. The tower-marked crates, they're loaded onto vessels positioned closest to the harbor mouth, as though they'll need the fastest exit. You think of modern supply chain management, and it's almost comical. 700 years ago, these men are running a logistical ballet that would make a freight company blush. You glance up at the fortress wall, half expecting to see a guard leaning over, squinting at the activity below. But the battlements are empty. Either the watch has been paid to look the other way, or the Templars have chosen their hour so well that the night guard hasn't yet made his rounds. Somewhere deep in the city, the faint clang of metal on stone rings out, followed by muffled shouts. You can't tell if it's a blacksmith's late work or the first ripple of the king's orders reaching La Rochelle. Whatever it is, the pace on the docks subtly quickens. Lines are coiled more briskly, crates vanish faster into the holds, and the cloaked figures no longer linger in conversation. One last cart appears, this one driven by an older man whose back is hunched with age. He guides his horse with the ease of someone who's done this route 1,000 times. In the cart bed is a single chest, unremarkable, except for the iron lock plate shaped like a shield. No one helps him unload. He climbs down, grips the chest by its side handles, and hauls it up the gangplank himself. The ship he boards is smaller than the others, almost unremarkable, exactly the kind of vessel that could slip away unnoticed in the wake of larger, more imposing ships. As he disappears below deck, you catch yourself holding your breath. You don't know what's in that chest, but whatever it is, it's part of the same quiet current running through this whole scene, a current pulling the Templars toward the Atlantic, toward a place no one else is supposed to find. And as the last crate is stowed and the final mooring lines are loosened, you realize you're watching not just a departure, but an erasure. By the time the sun rises, these ships will be somewhere else entirely, and La Rochelle will have nothing to show for their presence except wet planks and empty air. The harbor mouth is no wider than the throw of a stone, and tonight it feels even smaller, framed by the dark silhouettes of the breakwaters. You hear the water shifting out there, a slow, deliberate roll as the tide leans toward the open Atlantic. One ship makes the first move, not in a rush, but in that controlled, almost lazy way that comes from experience. The mooring lines are drawn in. The gangplank is already gone. The vessel slides away from the pier without a word shouted or a lantern waved. The sound of oars dipping into the water is barely more than a whisper, their rhythm perfectly matched. The ship doesn't turn toward the busy routes south to Bordeaux or east to Nantes. It aims straight for the gap in the breakwaters. The crew is nearly invisible shadows among shadows. You catch a glimpse of one man at the stern, his head bent toward the horizon, as if he's studying something only he can see. Another ship follows, then another. It's not a single dramatic exodus. It's a staggered procession, each departure masked by the creak of timbers and the wash of water against the piers. By the time you realize a ship is moving, it's already halfway to the harbor mouth. Historically, La Rochelle's outer waters could be treacherous for an unprepared crew. Shallow sandbanks lay just beyond the breakwaters, and if you didn't know the channels, you'd run aground in minutes. The Templars had no such trouble. They'd been running ships in and out of this port for decades, often under more dangerous circumstances, storms, sieges, even blockades. On shore, the activity has slowed to a hush. The remaining ships are ready, but their captains seem to be waiting, holding for a signal. You scan the harbor looking for some obvious cue, a lantern, a flag, but there's nothing visible. Then, from somewhere out near the mouth, a faint glint of light flashes twice. Within moments, another vessel begins to ease away from the pier. The air smells sharper now, the salt more pronounced as the tide draws seaward. You can hear the faint snap of a sail catching the breeze beyond the walls. The night is cloudless, but the moon is low enough that the harbor lies mostly in shadow. It's perfect cover. Quirky detail. The last ship to leave before you shift your view is a smaller craft with a single mast. Yet it's flying two triangular pennants, both plain white. Historians still argue whether double pennants like this were simply a way to indicate readiness for convoy travel, or a kind of covert recognition signal used by Allied ships. Either way, no merchant in their right mind would waste good cloth on redundant flags. You glance toward the fortress wall expecting some reaction, but the battlements are still empty. Maybe the watch has been bribed. Maybe the Templars have timed their departure to avoid inspection altogether. In either case, the absence of interference is striking. It's as though the entire port is holding its breath. Down on the far pier, a cloaked figure lingers. He isn't boarding any ship, just watching them go. From this distance, you can't see his face, but the stillness of his posture feels deliberate. He waits until the latest ship clears the breakwater, then turns and walks away from the docks, vanishing into the darkness between two warehouses. Whoever he is, he doesn't look like a man saying goodbye. He looks like someone who knows exactly where they're going to meet again. One of the larger vessels now makes its move. You watch it pivot smoothly its bow, aligning with the harbor mouth. For a moment, its hull blocks the view of the open sea beyond. Then it glides forward, sails unfurling with the faintest sigh of canvas. The red cross on the mainsail catches a sliver of moonlight, a last flash of identity before the darkness swallows it. You're so focused on the sight that you almost miss the sound, a deep, resonant knock from somewhere inland. Not a bell this time, but a wooden hammer striking something solid. 3 beats a pause, then 3 beats again. It could be nothing, or it could be the kind of signal no outsider is meant to hear. From the shadows near the customs house, a pair of men emerge carrying a bundle between them. The shape is awkward, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with rope. They move quickly, stepping over the gaps in the pier without slowing. The bundle disappears into the hold of the last ship at the pier. The captain of that vessel, a man with a trimmed beard and a weathered cloak, gives a short nod to the men before they vanish back into the dark. Then he looks toward the mouth of the harbor where the last of the earlier departures is already lost in shadow. The tide is at its height now. You can hear the subtle shift in the water's song against the pilings. The ship begins to move, the gentle groan of its hull breaking the near silence. You catch the faint scent of tar as the wind turns, carrying with it the promise of open sea. Historians still argue whether any of these departures were recorded officially. No manifests survive for the night of October 12, 1307. The royal records make no mention of Templar ships leaving La Rochelle in the days before the arrests. Some say the absence is proof they'd already gone. Others suspect the records were deliberately erased. Watching them now slipping away one by one, you can't imagine anyone recording this honestly, not if they valued their skin. You find yourself moving closer to the edge of the pier, the cold seeping through the soles of your boots. The last ship is almost at the breakwater now, its silhouette clean and sharp against the faint glow of moonlit surf. You wonder if anyone aboard has looked back, if they've taken one last glance at the fortress walls, the quiet city, the place they might never see again. Then the vessel passes beyond the point where the breakwaters frame the sea. It turns slightly, catching more of the wind, and in that moment it's gone from the harbor, from the records, from the reach of anyone who will try to find it tomorrow. In the stillness that follows, you hear only the lap of water against the stones, the creak of empty piers. The harbor that moments ago held the most formidable fleet in Europe is now a stage after the play, the actors gone, the set abandoned. You know the king's men will arrive soon. They'll storm into the port with their warrants and their accusations, demanding to know where the ships have gone. And the people here, those who loaded the crates, who steered the carts, who stood watch on the empty battlements, will say nothing. They'll shrug, feign confusion, claim ignorance. Because that's the final trick, isn't it? A departure is easy to notice. A disappearance. That can be made to look like nothing happened at all. The night air in La Rochelle feels different once the last ship has gone. The tide still breathes in and out, the masts of non-Templar vessels still clack faintly against their rigging. But the charge, the quiet hum of intent you've been feeling for hours, has drained away. In its place is a strange emptiness, as though the harbor has forgotten what it was just moments ago. You drift away from the piers, down one of the narrow, twisting streets that hug the waterfront. The smell of the sea gives way to damp stone, old wood, and the smoke of hearth fires. A low doorway spills a wedge of golden light onto the cobblestones ahead, and from inside comes the muffled rise and fall of voices. You step in. It's a tavern, not the rowdy, brawl-prone sort, but the kind where the fire burns low and the regulars keep their voices to a conversational murmur. The walls are stained with years of smoke, and the beams overhead sag just enough to make you wonder how they're still holding. At the far corner, a group of fishermen hunch over their mugs. Their faces are weathered, their hands nicked and scarred from years of hauling nets. One is speaking in a low, conspiratorial tone, glancing toward the door, as if to make sure no one new has entered. "You saw them," he's saying. "Not the knights, no their sails. White in the moon, but no cross showing. Slipped out like they'd been waiting all week for that tide." Another fisherman snorts. "You were halfway to drunk when you saw that." "I know what I saw," the first man insists, gripping his mug hard enough that the ale inside shivers. You move closer, sliding into a bench along the wall. You're not the only one listening. Two merchants at the next table lean slightly in your direction, their conversation about cargo prices abandoned. One of them, the younger with a thin mustache, asks, "And where do you think they were headed?" The fisherman shrugs. "North, maybe. Could be south. Didn't look like they were heading for the coast, though. Out to sea. Quirky detail. The tavern's only window is covered not with glass, but with oiled parchment. Through it, the blurred shapes of the harbor lights waver like candle flames. Someone has drawn a crude cross in the center of the parchment, as if to keep watch over the room. Historians still argue whether such marks in coastal taverns were meant as simple blessings for safe voyages or as quiet signals for those in certain clandestine circles. Near the hearth, an old man in a faded wool cap clears his throat. His voice is reedy but firm. "They won't be back," he says into the room, not looking at anyone in particular. "Not here. Not to these waters." There's a pause. The crackle of the fire fills it. Then a monk, his brown robe patched at the elbows, speaks from the shadows near the bar. "Some ships go north to Scotland. Some go south to Iberia. Some vanish." The old man shakes his head. "Vanishing's just what you call it when you don't know where to look." His words settle over the room like a blanket. You sip the weak ale you've been served, letting the voices swirl around you. One merchant mutters about rumors from the Breton coast fishermen, who claim to have seen red-crossed sails near the Isle of Wesson, sailing hard against the wind. Another swears a cousin in Bordeaux heard of Templar ships taking on fresh horses at an unnamed port before riding inland. A monk leans in to say he's copied manuscripts that mention the brotherhood at sea, a phrase no chronicler has ever been able to place. You're not sure how much of it is truth and how much is the ale loosening tongues. This is how it always goes. Rumors fatten themselves on distance, and everyone swears their own version is the closest to the truth. Historians still argue whether such tavern chatter preserved actual sightings or simply recycled the same tales until they hardened into local lore. A boy no older than 12 sidles in through the doorway, clutching a folded scrap of parchment. He hesitates, scanning the room, then crosses to the monk. The exchange is quick parchment for a copper coin. The monk tucks the paper into his sleeve without opening it. The boy lingers long enough to speak to the fisherman. "Saw one myself," he says. "Past the headland. White sail, no light moving, like it knew the rocks by heart." His voice is steady, but there's a faint tremor in it, the thrill of having seen something that might matter. The fishermen glance at one another, but no one laughs. You finish your drink and step back into the street. The night has thinned. The damp mist clings closer to the stones now, and the air is quieter as though the city has rolled over in its sleep. From somewhere inland comes the faint echo of a bell. It's not a harbor bell, this one's deeper, slower. You can't shake the feeling it's meant for someone specific. Down another narrow lane, you pass a shuttered shop with a sign carved into the shape of a ship's wheel. Beneath the carving is a small etching of a star and crescent weathered nearly smooth. You pause, tracing the grooves with your fingertips. Somewhere in your mind, it lines up with the marks you saw on the crates earlier. A shape moves in the alley beside you. It's a man middle-aged, his beard flecked with gray. He steps into the lamplight and gives a short nod toward the direction of the harbor. "They're gone," he says, as if you didn't already know. Then after a moment, "But the sea's wide. Wider than any king's reach." Before you can reply, he's gone again, swallowed by the alley. You continue walking until the harbor opens before you once more. It looks different now, emptier, yes, but also wider. The absence of the Templar fleet makes the water seem to stretch farther, as though their presence had been holding the world in place. Somewhere beyond the breakwaters, the ships are out there. Maybe they've already split apart, some heading north, others south, others west into the long, empty miles of the Atlantic. You think of the monk's voice in the tavern, "Some vanish," and you realize that's the problem with trying to follow a story like this. You can never be sure when the trail you're on is a real road, or just one someone has drawn to keep you walking in circles. The wind picks up, carrying the scent of kelp and cold iron. You pull your cloak tighter and turn back toward the city, leaving the harbor to the gulls and the dark water. Somewhere in another port or another tavern, voices are already trading the next version of the story. And maybe that's how the fleet intends to survive, not by staying hidden, but by being so many things to so many people that no one ever agrees on what they really saw. The road north out of La Rochelle feels like a thread unraveling from a spool. You keep following it, and the city behind you becomes smaller, dimmer, until all that's left is the steady rhythm of your own footsteps and the crunch of gravel under hoofbeats somewhere ahead. The night mist thickens into a low blanket beating on your cloak and lashes. You know where you're heading, though you haven't said it out loud yet, toward lands where the Pope's arrest orders never reached. The whispers in the tavern weren't the first you've heard. For weeks now, rumors have been rising like tidewater about a sanctuary far to the north Scotland. A place half the continent thinks of as a battlefield, but for a hunted order like the Templars, it's the gap in the fortress wall. Historically, you know the key fact: Pope Clement's papal bull condemning the Templars was ignored entirely by the Scots. They had their own quarrels with Rome, especially since Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated after killing John Comyn in a church. When you're already on the Pope's bad side, why bother arresting his enemies? The path bends inland, the sea now a faint hiss behind you. Ahead, the road climbs into heathland, where scrubby gorse brushes your boots, and the air smells faintly of peat smoke drifting from unseen farmsteads. You pass a crossroads marked with a weathered wooden post. Someone's carved a rough cross into it, not the blood-red emblem of the Templars, but deep enough that rainwater has darkened the cut to near black. Could be coincidence. Could be a sign for those who know how to read it. You find your first real clue in a coaching inn near the Breton border. The place is empty except for a sleepy innkeeper and a pair of riders who keep their hoods up even by the fire. You slide onto a bench near enough to overhear. Their accents aren't local. One speaks with the clipped vowels of northern France, the other with a lilting cadence you'd guess is Scottish. They speak of cargo transferred and the abbey in the glen as if discussing barrels of wine instead of something worth riding through the night to protect. When they rise to leave, the taller man drops a coin on the table. It flashes in the firelight. Not French, not English, but something older. You catch the faint outline of a cross pate on one side, and on the other a worn Latin inscription. You can't read it before it vanishes into the innkeeper's hand. Quirky detail: some collectors today swear that certain Scottish hoards contain coins just like that minted long before they should have been in circulation there. Historians still argue whether they were souvenirs from Crusader veterans or evidence of a deeper, more organized transfer of wealth. By the time you cross into lands loyal to Bruce, the landscape has changed. The hills are sharper, the air cooler, and the roads are less patrolled. You pass stone watchtowers where no guards challenge you, either because they don't care or because they already know you're not worth stopping. In small villages, you notice something odd: the church doors are never locked. The locals leave them open even at night, as though they're accustomed to strangers seeking shelter. One evening, you crest a ridge and see it a long, low valley dotted with torchlight. Beyond the clustered cottages rises the dark outline of a castle keep. The banner that flies from its tower is no papal standard. It's a rampant lion on gold, the arms of Scotland. You descend into the valley following the curve of the road until it delivers you to a narrow bridge guarded by two men in mail. They ask no questions when you give only a first name and say you're bound for the coast. Inside the great hall, the air is heavy with peat smoke and the smell of roasting meat. At the high table sits a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, Robert the Bruce himself, if the whispers are true. He speaks in low tones to a man dressed not in tartan or surcoat, but in a plain wool cloak fastened with a silver clasp. Even from here you see the clasp is in the shape of a cross. Not the proud red emblem of the Templars, but something subtler, almost shy. You don't approach. You don't need to. You can feel the undercurrent in the hall. These men are planning something: not just feasts and border skirmishes, but routes, rendezvous, transfers. And it's no stretch to imagine that a few ships from La Rochelle have found their way into these plans. Historically, the idea isn't far-fetched. Scotland was desperate for skilled fighters, and the Templars, exiled, armed, and disciplined, would have been a prize. Later in the stables, you hear more. Two grooms talk while brushing down the horses, their words muffled by the beasts' shifting hooves. One says a white-sailed ship put in at a cove 3 nights past. Men came ashore hooded and silent, carrying heavy chests up the cliff path. They rode off before dawn, heading inland. The grooms don't know where and they don't care, but they both agree the horses were the finest they'd ever seen Arabians trained for endurance. Quirky and telling the Templars had used Arabian horses for centuries, valuing their stamina over the bulk of European breeds. Historians still argue whether these sightings in Scottish stables are evidence of their presence or just borrowed legend. But standing here, hearing the detail in the grooms' voices, it feels real. You leave the valley at dawn, following a road that winds through moorland toward the western coast. The wind is sharper here, smelling of salt again. Along the way, you pass a ruined chapel. Its door is gone, the altar bare, but carved into the lintel is a small emblem, a cross within a circle, the same as the charm you saw around that dock worker's neck in La Rochelle. It's weathered, but unmistakable. By the time you reach the cliffs above the sea, the light is fading. Below you, the tide surges into a narrow inlet. Waves crash against the rocks, sending spray high into the air. And there, in the shelter of a rocky promontory, lies a small ship. Its sail is furled, its hull dark with pitch. You can't see any markings from here, but the shape of it, the cut of the bow, the height of the stern castle matches the Templar design you've been following for days. Men move on the deck, their figures hunched against the wind. One looks up toward the cliffs, scanning the horizon. For a moment, you think his gaze meets yours. Then he turns back to his work, and the ship becomes just another shadow among many. You stand there until the tide begins to turn, wondering if this is the end of their journey or just another stop in a chain that leads somewhere even further beyond the reach of kings. In the distance, the gulls wheel and cry over the whitecaps, as if mocking the idea that the sea will ever give up its secrets. The path from the mainland to the Isle of Mull is not an easy one even now. In the early 14th century, it would have been a gauntlet of cold, unpredictable seas, rocky shoals, and the moods of local clans who owed loyalty to no king in London, Paris, or even Edinburgh. You pick your way down to a shingle beach, where a single skiff lies pulled above the tide line. The man waiting beside it says nothing when you approach, just nods toward the dark silhouette of the island across the sound. The crossing is rough. Wind tumbles in from the open Atlantic, slapping spray against your face. The boat feels small against the scale of the water, and each wave seems eager to remind you of it. Still, your pilot rows with a rhythm that suggests he's done this in worse weather. Halfway across, you glance back at the mainland. Already the coast is just a jagged shadow fading behind a mist that seems to have been waiting for you. When the skiff scrapes against Mull's shore, the man steps out first, pulling the boat higher onto the rocks. His voice, when it finally comes, is low and clipped. Keep to the path. Don't wander. He doesn't wait for you to promise, just turns inland. The land here rises quickly into low hills, their flanks shaggy with bracken and gorse. The air smells of salt and peat, and somewhere in the distance you hear the thin cry of seabirds wheeling over unseen cliffs. The path threads between outcrops of basalt, each slick with moss. You notice markings on some of the stones, faint crosses carved in a style that feels older than the Templar red emblem. Some are tilted, as if they were meant to align with something in the sky rather than the ground beneath them. Your guide stops before a rocky bluff. At its base is a narrow opening, little more than a crack in the stone. He ducks inside without a word, and you follow the cool dampness of the earth swallowing the last traces of daylight. The air in the passage smells of stone and something else, old wood maybe, or cloth kept too long in the dark. The tunnel opens into a wider chamber, and you stop short. It's a vault built of fitted stone blocks, the kind of construction that lasts centuries if left undisturbed. Wooden crates and chests are stacked along one wall, their lids sealed with iron bands. Some are marked with symbols you've seen before, serpents, stars, towers. Others bear no marks at all. Quirky detail. One crate has a line of script burned into the wood in an alphabet you don't recognize. Later, you'll find out it matches a script used in certain Arabic astrological charts, something the Templars could have encountered during their time in the Levant. Historians still argue whether the order preserved such knowledge for practical navigation or for reasons more esoteric. The man gestures toward a particular chest, smaller than the others, its lid wrapped in waxed cloth. "That one stays," he says, as if you'd been about to touch it. You nod, though your curiosity itches. You're not allowed much time in the vault. Your guide leads you back through the tunnel, and when you emerge into daylight, you realize you've lost your bearings entirely. The path back to the shore takes a different route, skirting a stand of wind-bent trees before spilling you out onto a narrow cove. Anchored just offshore is a ship not large but built for speed. Its hull is dark, the sail furled. Even from here, you can tell it's of the same design you saw in La Rochelle high stern castle reinforced prow, a balance between cargo space and maneuverability. A small group waits on the beach, 3 men cloaked against the wind. One steps forward to meet you. His face is shadowed, but you see the glint of a silver clasp at his throat shaped like a cross within a circle. Without preamble, he asks, "What did you see?" You tell him the crates, the symbols, the sealed chest. He listens without interrupting, then nods once and turns away. "It will hold," he says to one of the others. "The tides are in our favor. You're not invited aboard." Instead, you watch from the rocks as they load a few smaller crates into a rowboat and ferry them out to the waiting ship. The operation is quiet, efficient, each man knowing his role, each movement part of a plan that's been rehearsed many times. By the time the last crate is stowed, the tide has turned. The ship's sail unfurls with a snap, catching the wind. It slides out of the cove and disappears behind a headland, leaving only the long echo of waves breaking on the rocks. You ask your guide where the ship is headed, but he only shrugs. "Away," he says. That's all that matters. The walk back to the skiff feels longer. You keep thinking about the vault, the precision of its stonework, the marks on the crates, the way some of them matched what you saw in La Rochelle. This isn't just a hideout. It's a repository. And if Mull holds one, how many more might be scattered across the fringes of Europe? As the skiff noses back into the mainland harbor, you catch sight of a weathered stone set into the quay. Its face is carved with a date, September 12th, and nothing else. You recall the carved date at La Rochelle, a month before the arrests. Historians still argue whether such markings were deadlines, warnings, or simply memorials. But 2 identical dates in 2 ports tied to the Templar trail feel like more than coincidence. The tide slaps against the quay. The gulls cry overhead. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a ship you'll never see again is carrying its cargo further from the grasp of kings. The air feels warmer as you follow the trail south, away from the raw wind of the Scottish Isles. By the time you reach the Portuguese coast, the light has changed to softer, honeyed gilding the stone walls of harbors that have seen more than their share of comings and goings. Here the sea smells different, less of cold iron and more of sun-warmed salt olive oil and fish roasting somewhere just out of sight. It's easy to forget standing in the bustling port of Lisbon that in 1307 the city was still a frontier between worlds half turned toward the Atlantic, half bound to the unfinished business of the Reconquista. King Dennis sits the throne here, the so-called farmer king, known for his poetry, his legal reforms, and more relevant to you, his stubborn independence. When the Pope's order to arrest the Templars arrived, Dennis didn't leap to obey. He stalled, delayed, negotiated. By the time Rome pressed harder, he had found another way to dissolve the order on paper, resurrect it under a new name. You wander the quay, listening to the slap of rigging against masts. A fisherman calls out in Portuguese, gesturing at a coil of nets, but the words you're really straining for are the low, hurried ones passed between men in woolen cloaks. Near the customs house you catch just enough Tomar, one says, and Irmandad brotherhood. They nod toward a squat vessel moored at the far end, its hull dark with pitch, its crew keeping to themselves. Historically, this is the point where the Templar cross begins to fade from public view. In 1319, Pope John XIII officially recognizes the Order of Christ, transferring Templar lands in Portugal into its keeping. But here in the years just after 1307, the transformation is still fresh. You can see it in the ships, no longer marked openly, but still built to the same proportions. No longer flying a red cross, but still manned by men who move with that same tight, economical precision you saw in La Rochelle. You decide to travel inland, following the road to Tamar. The journey takes you through rolling farmland and olive groves, past whitewashed villages where the air smells of bread and warm dust. The castle at Tamar rises out of the hills like something half-born of the rock itself, its walls thick, its towers topped with strange, almost Eastern flourishes. Inside the keep, the corridors are cool and dim. You pass under an archway where a faded painting shows a ship, not a caravel, not the kind Portugal will one day send around the Cape, but a high-sterned vessel with a profile you know too well. Its sail bears no emblem now, just a pale wash of color, but you swear you can still see the ghost of a cross beneath the paint. In the chapel, a mosaic on the floor catches your eye. A compass rose pointing not only northeast, south, and west, but toward a fifth direction marked with a symbol that looks like a ship beneath a flared cross. Quirky detail locals call it the path to the setting sun, though no one seems to agree on what it means. Historians still argue whether such symbols in Tomar were decorative flourishes, navigational cues, or quiet acknowledgments of voyages that never entered the official record. You're shown to a small chamber overlooking the courtyard. From here you watch as a group of men unload crates from a wagon. The crates are plain, but one bears a familiar serpent mark worn but visible in the low light. The men carry it not to the storerooms, but to a side door that disappears into the base of the keep. The door shuts behind them with a thud. Later that night, you follow the curve of the wall to a postern gate. Beyond it, a narrow path leads down to the riverbank, where 3 ships are moored in the shadows. They're not fishing boats. Their hulls are deep-bellied, their masts sturdy enough for long voyages. Lantern light spills from one, illuminating a pair of sailors bent over a rolled chart. You can't see the details, but you notice the chart is weighted with a carved stone, the same double spiral motif you saw back in Mull. One of the men looks up, scanning the bank. You step back into the dark, heart pounding. When you look again, the chart is gone and the sailors are hauling a barrel aboard. The next morning, the ships are gone. No one in the town seems surprised. At the market, an old woman selling figs says simply, "They come and go. Always west with the tide." You ask what's in the cargo, but she only smiles, showing a row of teeth worn flat by age. By now the pattern is clear. In Portugal, the Templars haven't just survived, they've adapted. The Order of Christ gives them coverland and royal protection. In return, they give the crown their ships, their skills, and perhaps something more, knowledge gathered across decades of crusade and trade. It's the perfect arrangement for men who want to keep moving without drawing the wrong kind of attention. As you prepare to leave Tamar, you take one last look at the castle from the road. The morning sun strikes its walls, and for a moment, you catch the glint of something high in the chapel window, a flash of red quickly gone. You wonder if it was just the play of light, or a reminder that whatever name they go by now, the Brotherhood at sea is far from finished with its voyage. The road from Tamar tilts gradually toward the coast, and the closer you get, the more you start to feel the pull of something not entirely visible. An invisible current tugging your attention westward. Portugal in the early 14th century is a kingdom with one foot planted in the old world and the other testing the edge of something new. Farmers are still pulling olives from groves their great-grandfathers planted, but in the ports, there's a whisper about islands beyond the horizon, places not found in any papal register. You reach Lisbon again, but this time you're not drawn to the bustling public docks. You head instead toward the quieter shipyards, the ones near the mouth of the Tagus, where the warehouses lean into one another, and the smell of tar is so thick you can taste it. Here men speak in half-sentences. A nod replaces a handshake. A glance toward the river replaces any mention of departure time. In a shadowed corner of the quay, you see it a rolled chart, being passed from one hand to another. The parchment is thick edges, darkened with wear. The man receiving it doesn't unroll it. He simply tucks it into a leather case and walks away. You catch a glimpse of the case's clasp, a small flared cross, the tips widening like petals. Not the proud red of the old order, but the shape is burned into your memory now. Historically, this is where the record gets tantalizing but frustrating. A few surviving Portuguese documents from the early 1300s hint at foreign timber and cloths of strange dye arriving from beyond the wind. It's a poetic phrase, but in maritime slang of the period, it sometimes meant from the west, far west. Historians still argue whether it referred to islands like the Azores, which weren't officially recorded until later, or to something further still. You follow a lead to Setúbal, a smaller port south of Lisbon. The harbor there is a patchwork of fishing boats and larger vessels built for deep water. The tide is low, and the mudflats glisten in the sun. A man mending a net looks up as you pass. "You're late," he says in accented French, as though he's been expecting you. Before you can answer, he nods toward a narrow pier at the far end. They're almost loaded. The pier is half hidden behind a stack of drying fish racks. But once you slip past, you see the activity, two ships, their hulls freshly tarred, taking on barrels and crates from carts that have come down the back streets, rather than through the main market. The barrels are stenciled with markings you've seen before, a coiled serpent, a star, a tower, but they've been smudged with ash or mud as if to obscure them from casual view. You notice something else: the sails, still furled, are cut slightly wider and shorter than most Iberian ships. That design would let them maneuver better in shifting Atlantic winds. It's the kind of adjustment you'd make if you expected to be out in open water for weeks at a time. Quirky detail. One crate being lowered into the hold has its lid carved with a compass rose. But instead of the usual 4 or 8 points, this one has 11. The 11th point is elongated, reaching past the circle that contains the rest. Historians still argue whether the number 11 was a Templar symbol of duality or simply a shipwright's signature. Either way, it doesn't seem like the kind of thing you'd put on a random cargo crate. You step closer, pretending to examine the rope coiled on a bollard. Snippets of conversation drift your way, references to currents that run under the skin of the sea stars that tilt lower and land where the gulls are strangers. The men speak as though these things are common knowledge among them, but never define them outright. One of the captains, a tall man with weather-browned skin, catches you looking. His gaze is steady, but not unfriendly. "You'll not find your way where we're going," he says in Portuguese. Then in French more softly, "Not unless you already know the map." That night, back in Lisbon, you find yourself in a dockside tavern. It's loud with sailors' laughter, but at a table in the corner, two older men speak in low tones over a jug of wine. One is sketching on the tabletop with a fingertip dipped in the spill a rough outline of a coastline, a scattering of dots offshore. When he wipes it away, he does it slowly, as if erasing the drawing from more than just the wood. You think of the reports from La Rochelle, the crates marked with unfamiliar symbols, the meticulous loading the silence. If a portion of that fleet came here to Portugal, it wouldn't have been to disappear entirely. This country is a launch point, not an ending. The Order of Christ, with its royal sanction and maritime reach, is the perfect disguise for preparing something larger, something that needs to be done out of sight of both France and Rome. At dawn, you walk the quay again. The ships from Setúbal are gone, leaving only wet impressions of their keels in the mud and a few stray coils of rope. The river smells of departure. Out past the breakwater, a line of small sails catches the morning sun for just a moment, before vanishing into the haze where river meets ocean. Historians will later look at Portugal's sudden burst of navigational prowess in the 15th century and wonder how a small kingdom leapt so quickly ahead. Some will say it was genius, others luck, others the inevitable reward of persistence. But here, watching the mouth of the Tagus swallow those westward-bound ships, you can't help thinking about maps, already drawn stars, already charted, and a brotherhood that has been moving quietly, methodically, for years. The water laps against the quay, rhythmic and patient. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the red cross may be gone from the sails, but you know it's still there in the design of the hulls, in the hands that hold the tiller, in the eyes, scanning the waves for signs only they understand. You've been chasing the ships for weeks now, and each harbor gives you pieces of the story enough to keep you moving, never enough to say you've truly arrived anywhere. By the time you're back in France, your head is thick with sightings, half-truths, and contradictions. But there's one thread that keeps pulling you the treasure. No one says it outright in polite company, but in the taverns, markets, and whispered alleys, the word comes up again and again. Not just gold, though that's what most listeners latch onto, but relics, objects the church would have wanted secrets, the kings would have paid dearly to control. In a village near the Bay of Biscay, you meet a man who claims his grandfather once ferried sealed coffers from La Rochelle to an abbey inland. The abbey's long gone, now burned during a skirmish with English troops, but the man swears the coffers never left. They're buried where the bell tower fell, he says, eyes darting as if afraid the trees might overhear. Historically, you know, Templar wealth wasn't just a hoard of coins. It was land deeds, charters, banking records, coded correspondence tools for influence that could be more valuable than silver. If even part of that material escaped Philip IV's grasp, it could have shifted alliances, even toppled a throne. Historians still argue whether such caches existed, or whether they're just the product of centuries of wishful thinking. You take the road inland, following the man's directions. The abbey ruins stand on a low rise, their stone walls crumbling into the earth. Wildflowers spill over the old foundations. In the center where the bell tower once rose, you find a patch of ground where the grass grows unevenly. You can almost imagine the shape of something long buried beneath. Quirky detail wedged into one of the fallen stones is a shard of glass, thick, greenish, and faintly warped. Monastic glass was rare and costly, often imported from Venice. This piece is etched with what looks like a pair of crossed keys, though the marks are faint. It's the kind of thing that could have been decoration, or a quiet way of claiming ownership. Further south, you hear a different kind of treasure story. In the port of Bayonne, An old dock worker swears that one of the fleeing ships stopped here briefly, taking on fresh water and salted meat before heading out again. Its captain, he says, paid in coins. No one here had ever seen thin silver discs with writing so cramped it looked like scratches. Some say the coins came from Cyprus, others from the Levant, still others from lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules. That phrase, beyond the pillars, starts to repeat itself. You hear it from a wine merchant in Bordeaux, from a sailor in La Coruna, from a monk in a coastal priory, who insists the fleet was carrying the bones of a saint who never lived. The stories contradict each other, but they all share a single truth: the fleet's cargo mattered enough to move quickly, quietly, and far from where any royal hand could reach. One night in a smoky inn near the Spanish border, you're drawn into a dice game with a handful of merchants. The stakes are small, the ale weak, but the talk turns lively. One merchant leans in his breath, sour with wine, and tells you about the vault under the salt. You press for details, and he says there's a cavern on the Galician coast where barrels of salt have been stacked for generations, not for trade, but to hide something else entirely. Salt preserves, he says with a grin. And not just fish. The image sticks with you. If the Templars wanted to store something for decades or centuries, salt would keep it dry, keep it from rotting, keep it from smelling like anything worth a customs search. You make your way there, though. The directions are more like riddles than a map. The coast is jagged, the sea loud against the rocks. At low tide, you find a narrow opening, half hidden by seaweed. Inside, the air is dry despite the crash of water nearby. Your torchlight flickers over stacked barrels, their tops crusted white. You tap one, it's solid, heavier than it should be for salt alone. You have no way of knowing if this is truly Templar cargo, but in the silence of the cavern, you can believe it. Historians would scoff without proof. They'd ask for coins, seals, documents. But standing there, you realize that's the point. This treasure, whatever it is, was never meant to be found by anyone who didn't already know exactly where to look. Back in the harbor towns, the talk shifts from where the fleet went to what it left behind. Some say there's a chest buried under the nave of a church in Brittany, sealed so tightly, the masons swore oaths never to touch it. Others claim the fleet split its treasure among a dozen small ports, scattering the clues so that no single capture could doom the whole. In your quieter moments, you wonder if the treasure is even physical anymore. Maybe it's a network of promises, a web of loyalties stretching across coasts and kingdoms. Gold can be stolen, relics can be broken, but trust, if you hide it well, can outlast them all. Still, the thought of those sealed crates and hidden vaults gnaws at you. You picture the serpent, mark the star, the tower symbols that have followed you from La Rochelle to Scotland to Portugal. You picture them tucked away in the dark, waiting for a tide that may never come. The sea outside your window murmurs against the quay. Somewhere out there, ships are still moving, ships whose names were never written down, whose cargoes were never listed, whose captains knew better than to tell the same story twice. And you realize that chasing the treasure might be the only way to follow the fleet, even if you never see its sails again. You start noticing them once you know what to look for. Ships that seem ordinary at first glance, but carry an echo of something you've seen before. The curve of a hull, the proportion of mast, to deck the way the stern castle sits just a little higher than necessary. They pass through busy ports, without fanfare, blending in among Genoese merchantmen and Venetian galleys, never raising the suspicion of officials. In Marseille, you spot one at anchor just beyond the main quay. Its hull is painted in muted stripes of green and black colors that match no known house or trading company. The sail is patched in places, but the patches themselves form a pattern that feels too deliberate to be accidental. You squint, and for a moment the arrangement of pale cloth against darker canvas forms the faint outline of a cross. Then the sail shifts in the breeze and it's gone, Historically, this wasn't unusual. Captains of many nations would repaint or restitch their ships to hide their origins. But the Templars had an added layer of skill. They were used to operating in contested waters, where displaying the wrong emblem could get you sunk or seized. Historians still argue whether post-1307 sightings like these were genuinely Templar or simply merchants copying a successful design. You linger on the quay until dusk, watching the ship's crew at work. They load amphorae from a cart, each one marked only with a single horizontal line scratched into the clay. No merchant seal, no origin stamp. Amphorae this plain would fetch suspicion in most ports, but here no one seems to care. The dockmaster notes something in his ledger, but the page is shielded from view. Quirky detail. When the last amphora is loaded, a sailor tosses a small wooden token to a boy on the dock. It's about the size of a coin, carved with a crude depiction of a key inside a circle. You've seen this before in La Rochelle, in Mull, and Tamar. The boy slips it into his pocket without looking at it, as if the exchange is entirely routine. 2 days later in Barcelona, you see another vessel with the same proportions, but a completely different disguise. This one flies the red and white of Genoa, its deck crowded with sacks of grain. The crew speak Italian loudly and with an almost theatrical exaggeration, as if overcompensating. But when they think no one's listening, their tone shifts and you catch a snatch of French, short-clipped, purposeful. A merchant at the quay leans over and tells you in confidence that not all these Genoese ships are what they claim. Some, he says, belong to the brotherhood that wears no badge. He taps the side of his nose and offers no further explanation. From Spain to the Balearics, you keep seeing them. Sometimes it's just the angle of a prow disappearing behind a headland. Sometimes it's more concrete, a crew using hand signals you saw in La Rochelle, or cargo crates marked with faint symbols beneath a layer of fresh paint. The disguises aren't perfect, but they don't need to be. Ports are busy places, and most eyes are fixed on their own business. One evening in Palma, you follow a lead from a dock worker to a small cove outside the city. The tide is out, and 3 ships sit low in the water, their hulls scraped clean of barnacles. The work is quiet, without the shouting and clatter you'd expect from a refit. Tar boils in a cauldron over a low fire, and the smell clings to everything. One ship's stern bears the name Santa Lucia in careful gold paint, but when you look closely, you can see where another name has been planned away beneath it. You ask the dock worker why ships would hide their past names. He shrugs, because sometimes it's safer to be someone new. Historians still argue whether the Templar fleet dispersed into merchant service under false flags, or kept to a unified plan in disguise. Some suggest both could be true, that individual captains made their own choices while still maintaining a loose network of trust. You test this theory in Tunis, far across the sea. The harbor there is a chaos of colors, languages, and smells, spices from the east, camels groaning under bales of cloth, fishermen gutting their catch beside long-distance traders. Among the jumble, you notice a ship with a design you could sketch from memory now, high stern, sloped bow, the faint suggestion of reinforcing beams along the hull. This one flies no flag at all. Its crew wear tunics without any insignia. You linger by a spice stall until you see one of them disembark. He's a tall man with a weathered face and the walk of someone who knows how to fight without wanting to. Around his neck is a cord, and on it a charm shaped like that same cross in a circle emblem. He catches you looking and covers it with his hand before disappearing into the crowd. Back in the European ports, you hear the same rumor over and over that some of these disguised ships travel in pairs or trios, never more than a day's sail apart. They use coastal features, headlands, inlets, hidden coves to keep each other in sight without drawing attention. If one is boarded, the others can scatter or double back to recover what matters most. The more you hear, the more you realize the disguise isn't just about appearance, it's about movement. By blending in with merchant traffic, these ships can follow established trade routes, stop at common ports, and never give any single authority enough evidence to connect them to the missing fleet. One night in Marseille, you see it happen. Two ships, one painted in Venetian colors, the other in the green and gold of Aragon, leave within an hour of each other, heading in different directions. But from a vantage point on the cliffs, you watch them both curve back toward the same course once they're out of sight of the harbor. By morning, their specks on the same horizon, sails angled to catch the same wind. It's not proof, not in the way a historian would demand, but it's enough for you. Enough to see how the fleet could survive for years, even decades, as a shadow in plain sight. And as you stand there watching the wind carry them away, you can't help but think the Templars didn't just vanish. They learned how to be invisible while still moving exactly where they wanted to go. By now, you've chased the ghost of the Templar fleet across half the known world. You've stood on cold Scottish cliffs, peered into Portuguese vaults, followed disguised ships through Mediterranean ports, and walked away from salt-stacked caverns that still haunt your thoughts at night. Each sighting, each half-heard rumor has drawn you further into a story without an ending, because maybe the ending was never meant to be written. And now here you are in a harbor where no one even pretends to keep records of arrivals and departures. It's a place the maps barely bother to mark a crooked spit of land in the Canaries, where the wind is never still and the gulls wheel in circles like they're trying to read something only they can see. The air is thick with the smell of sun-baked rope and seaweed, the kind of scent that seeps into your skin. The dock here is warped, uneven, and scattered with sand. A few fishing boats bob lazily near shore, but further out, anchored in a quiet curve of the bay, you see them. Two ships, hulls low in the water from their loads, sails furled. No flags fly, no markings show, yet every line of their construction whispers the same story you've been chasing. High sterns, reinforced prows, deck layouts that seem designed for speed, maneuverability, and defense all at once. The locals barely glance at them. A fisherman with a sun-bleached hat spits into the water and mutters something about old friends when you ask. You press, and he shrugs. They come, they go. Never trouble anyone here. Pay fare for fish. You take a path up the bluff overlooking the bay. From there you can see more men moving on deck with the quiet coordination you've seen in every port that hid their kind. Crates are being shifted, not unloaded, not loaded, just moved as if reorganizing for another long stretch at sea. You spot the serpent mark again, faint under layers of wear on one of the crate ends. Quirky detail on the mainmast of the nearer ship, a small wind vane turns lazily in the breeze. It's shaped like a bird, not a dove or gull, but something more exotic with a long tail. Later, you'll remember that some medieval navigators used bird-shaped vanes to honor distant lands where such species lived. Historians still argue whether these were decorative or symbolic of trade routes outside official knowledge. You sit there until the sun drops low and the sea turns gold, thinking about every place you've been since La Rochelle. Every rumor, every false lead, every moment you were sure you'd finally cornered the truth, only for it to slip just out of reach. And you realize something: the fleet's survival has never depended on keeping still. It's depended on movement, on being where no one expects under a name no one recognizes for just long enough to leave again. You imagine the first days after the order's arrest, the scramble to send messages ahead, to gather supplies, to decide who would go where. Some ships taking to the open Atlantic, others hugging coasts, others vanishing into rivers or marshes. Maybe some were lost to storms or piracy, but enough must have survived to seed this pattern, a brotherhood, without ports whose home was the water itself. Historically, this theory isn't without support. Even hostile chroniclers admitted that not all Templar assets were seized, and that some members could not be found. Maritime historians note gaps in shipping records in the years following 1307 ships that left one port and were never recorded at their next destination. Historians still argue whether those were simple losses or deliberate disappearances. You picture the fleet splintering, reforming, carrying not only treasure and relics, but knowledge maps, currents, safe harbors, weather patterns learned over decades. Knowledge you could hand to a future ally or keep locked away until the tides of politics turned. Knowledge that could in the right hands make or break kingdoms. As twilight deepens, the ships in the bay stir. Lanterns flare briefly, then are shuttered. Men coil ropes, adjust sails, and within minutes the anchor chains rattle up. The vessels ease away from their moorings with barely a splash, turning their prows toward the horizon. No shouted orders, no fanfare. Just the quiet certainty of people who know exactly what they're doing. You watch until they are only dark shapes against the last burn of the sun. And then they're gone, just like in La Rochelle, just like in every other port you followed them to. Gone, leaving only the sound of the waves and the empty stretch of water where they'd been. The stars come out overhead, bright in the clear island sky. You find yourself tracing the constellations, wondering which ones the Templars steered, by which ones marked the edges of their maps. Maybe those maps are still out there, folded in oilcloth in the bottom of a chest, passed from one trusted hand to another over the centuries. You take a long breath. For the first time, you feel the weight of the chase lift a little, because maybe the point was never to find the fleet tied up neatly in one place. Maybe the point was to see how far its shadow stretched, how many places it touched, without ever staying long enough to be caught. And you realize you've been walking their path all along. So now, as you sit with the sound of the tide in your ears, let the rest of the world fade for a while. Picture that last harbor again, not the bustle of Lisbon or the sharp winds of Mull, but that quiet curve of sand where the water moved slow and the ships rocked gently, patient as breathing. The air warm, the gulls tracing lazy loops overhead, the smell of salt softened by distance. Let the ships slip away over the horizon, their sails catching the last gold light before folding into the blue. Imagine the way the water smooths itself behind them, as though nothing had passed at all. You're left with the hush of evening, the faint hiss of waves on the shore, the steady rhythm that's been here long before the Templars, and will be here long after. The stars begin to prick the sky, one by one. You might think of them as the same ones the fleet followed, but tonight they're only for you, steadfast, unhurried, watching from their high, cold perches. Let your breath match the rise and fall of the tide. In and out. All the questions, all the speculation about treasure, about maps, about secret harbors, they can drift for now. There will be other nights to follow those trails, other days to chase the shapes on the water. Tonight you can let them be just that, shapes. Shadows. Whispers on the wind. Feel the sand cool under your palms, the air brushing your skin. The tide will turn again soon, but for now it's at its gentlest. And somewhere beyond what you can see, the fleet keeps moving, quiet, patient, and free. Sleep well.